Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a little bit past 3 o'clock, and that means that it's time for another meeting. Today, it's a pleasure to introduce to you Christel van Eck. She is an assistant professor of corporate communication at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research, and Christel joined the school a couple months ago after she did her PhD at Wageningen University, and has been working on climate change communication, and done really interesting work on the blogosphere. So how do people talk about this in different sides of the climate change debate, and is really doing cutting edge work on this particular topic. What is also interesting is that Christel is really doing what universities want us to do. So she's an active member of the Klimaat Help Desk, advises, answers questions from young kids about climate, and has a big network among climate scientists nationally and internationally. So I'm really happy that she came today to give a talk. I believe you just came back from holiday, so this is always a good start. And Christel, I'm really excited that we have you today. I hope also this is the start of more interactions with our group. So that said, the floor is yours.
Yes, well, thank you, Bert, for the introduction and also for having me here today. So what I would like to do today, I quickly share my screen. I would like to present my work on about a paper in which I conceptualize online climate change polarization. I did a literature review. Let me see. Okay. And so I want to present my preliminary results of this literature review, where I conceptualize online climate change polarization, as this is really what I'm interested in. What is the role of the online world in climate change polarization? And that's also what my research focuses on now. But I first want to share with you, or no, before I start with that, maybe it's good to have some interaction and see how would you define as researchers online climate change polarization? It could be a definition, it could be some associations, what you have with this term. So I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about that.
Anyone here wants to respond to that?
Well, I would say a situation in which people disagree with their political opponents on the existence of climate change and whether or not it's man-made, then that's occurring online, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think many people agree with you. Well, what I found was that there are many people that also apply this definition, but there is also a little bit of a disagreement about various aspects of climate change polarization. And that's something that I noticed during my PhD research on the blogosphere, in which I investigated the role of the blogosphere in positional, interactional, and effective climate change polarization. And I noticed when I was investigating the blogosphere that there are these different forms of polarization, and that also researchers are using these terms interchangeably. So that's why I came up with a framework about positional climate change polarization, which is basically about what you also say, these different positions that people could have around climate change. So, for example, different attitudes, different ideologies, different opinions. The other form is interactional climate change polarization, that really focuses much more on how people interact with one another and whether there is even interaction. So, for example, you have these eco-chambers where people are really disconnected from other viewpoints that challenge their own viewpoints about climate change. And last but not least, effective climate change polarization. That's not really about the cognition and the position, but more about the emotional and affective evaluations towards the other climate change party that you're opposed to. So these are the three forms of climate change polarization that I came up with. And before I want to share a bit more about the literature review, that I focused on the entire online world rather than only the blogosphere, I want to share with you some results of my PhD research. And the first article that I would like to share with you about is Parallel Routes from Copenhagen to Paris, Climate Discourse in Climate Activist and Climate Skeptic Blogs, which is a paper that I've co-authored with Peter Fines and is published in Environmental Policy and Planning. And what we did here was that we already knew from previous research that you could identify two communities in the blogosphere. On the one hand, a climate skeptical community, and on the other hand, a climate mainstream community. And what we did was that we investigated what is this polarization? How does this manifest itself in the discursive structures in the blog posts of bloggers? So we investigated the blogs of climate skeptic blogs and climate activist blogs. And we investigated these discourse on the basis of a theoretical framework that we've adapted slightly from a paper from Dalton and Brown. And we looked at what is the ontology of both of the discourses, what kind of assumptions about the natural relationships do they make? So for example, do they believe that climate change is happening? Is it human caused, yes or no? Or is the climate, has it always been changing? What kind of assumptions do they make? The third aspect is we looked at the agents and their motives. So we coded the text to see, do they portray actors, for example, as either heroes, villains, or victims? The fourth aspect that we looked at was the rhetorical devices. So how did they frame climate change? So for example, how did they put climate change in a particular light? So for example, this is something that we should not do something about, or we should, or as a financial opportunity, or as a financial challenge, etc., etc. And the last aspect that we looked at was the normative judgments. Did they make any explicit statements about what should happen or what we should do? So, and on the basis of this framework, we identified or coded 5 climate skeptical blogs and 5 climate activist blogs, a data set of 357 blog posts. And we used this theoretical framework as the deductive codes, and we inductively identified subcodes in these main categories. And then our results. We identified in the climate skeptical discourse basically 4 storylines. Well, this first storyline is maybe not surprising to you. This is the hoax storyline. And this is really about that climate skeptics really convey the story that climate change is a hoax, that it is a conspiracy, that all climate scientists, politicians, and everyone who basically accepts the scientific mainstream position is colluding. Well, I think you are all familiar with this hoax storyline. This was also the most prominent storyline in all the climate skeptical blog posts. The second storyline was really rooted in the scientific ontology. It was about no scientific evidence. So they argued that there was no scientific evidence for climate change, that they analyzed many climate mainstream science posts and said, like, this is not sound, this is not sound, this is not sound. But then the interesting part is we also identified a third storyline about climate skeptical science. So whereas they opposed to this climate mainstream science, they also proposed an alternative science. So this climate skeptical science, where they also portrayed scientists, the climate skeptical scientists, as the heroes, for example. They also used a lot of rhetoric where they framed their science as very scientific. So they used rhetoric like saying, this professor and doctor, it is peer reviewed. So really this terminology to confirm that the science is of good quality. And fourth storyline that was not very prominent, but it was there and was also a bit surprising to us, was this injustice storyline, where they really framed acting upon climate change as something that is unjust, that the victims of acting upon climate changes are the general public or the taxpayers, because they only have to pay more. People cannot benefit anymore of capitalism. Also, the developing world they portrayed very often as the victims. That was interesting to notice, because That's of course a storyline that is opposed to one of the storylines in the climate activist discourse that you might all are all familiar with. So I'm referring to the second storyline here, the social justice storyline, where activists often say that it's really important that it's a matter of social justice to act upon climate change. The first storyline about action, well, it's also quite straightforward. It's about that we need to campaign together, that we need to take action, that politicians should take responsibility, that action is needed. So that's also what you would expect, of course, from a climate activist. And the third storyline that we have identified was the disaster strike storyline. That was really a storyline about that was very apocalyptic, that the world is going to disappear, that we're all going to die, that the impacts are very severe and very extreme. It was a very negative storyline. The fourth storyline, it was already a bit more nuanced, and it was say that there is still time left, but we should not act too late. This is also interesting, by the way. I'm using the word "we should not." This is also rhetoric that the climate activists used a lot. They used the tone of "we" a lot to really express that there was a world of engagement, that they want to involve people in their narrative. And the last storyline was the opportunity storyline, where they framed climate change really as an opportunity, for example, a financial opportunity or a technological opportunity. It was not a very prominent storyline, but it was there. So two things I want to highlight is that what was really interesting was that, and also surprising in comparison to previous academic scholarship, is that we identified this climate skeptical science storyline. What is often assumed about climate skeptics is that they have an anti-science attitude, whereas our research actually confirmed that these climate skeptics are not anti-science. No, they are anti-mainstream science. So they also proposed a storyline that's where science is a good thing, that science should be of good quality. So, and this is really something that many, or in public discourse especially, that is what is not expected from climate skeptics. It's against science often. And also another thing that was interesting was that what we noticed that climate activists throughout the years, that they communicated about climate change in a much more effective way. So whereas in the beginning of the years, they really, for example, they had the disaster strikes narrative, where it was really apocalyptic. They changed this storyline later in the years. We saw more the opportunity storyline, for example. It really resembles how, well, the impacts are getting worse over the years, actually, that this positive framing is much more effective when you want to engage people in this whole climate change story. And another thing that we also noticed was that, for example, whereas in the beginning of the years, they really focused on the global climate change impacts, of really large impacts, that throughout the years, they really started to focus on more the local impacts, to really invoke some sort of place identity, which academic scholarship on climate change communication also teaches, that people are much more engaged if you show the local impacts. So it was interesting to see how climate activists really learned to communicate more effectively throughout the years. So overall, what we found was that this polarization is really grounded in the discursive structures of the climate skeptical discourse and the climate activist discourse, as they all use opposing rhetorical devices. They make different assumptions about the natural relationships. They portrayed the heroes and villains exactly opposite. And also interesting is that the climate activists gave much normative guidance on what should happen. That really, like, we should take action, we should hold the politicians, hold them to account, etc., etc. Whereas climate skeptics really refrained from giving any normative guidance, which was interesting to see. Only very few times they made a normative judgment that the sign should be revisited. So that was a first article that I've written, and another article is about online climate change polarization. Here it's already in the name. Interactional framing analysis of climate change blog comments, which I've co-authored together with Bob Mulder and Arthur Wolf, which is now published in Science Communication. And whereas I first looked at the bloggers, in this article, I really focused on the comment sections and the commenters. What I did was that I looked at how commenters interacted, as I was interested in often climate change communication research focuses on frames to see, are certain frames effective, for example? Do they resonate with people's values, and then people adopt these frames? However, what we often see is that frames are not resonating and that there are still a lot of disagreements. So I was interested in knowing what happens when people disagree, when there is a framing difference. So for that reason, we applied interactional framing theory. So interactional framing theory focuses on, rather than frames like mental modes, so between the ears, it focuses on what happens in the interactions and how frames evolve over time throughout an interaction. So really about the interactions between the noses rather than between the ears. And as a starting point, we looked at a framing difference. So this is a situation where people are, where their frames are not aligned. And we've identified these first. Oh, maybe first introduce a bit more. And to see, after that, we looked at what kind of framing category strategies deployed these users. You could categorize basically these strategies into three types of frames. First of all, issue frames. Well, is it when users were interacting about a certain issue, or identity and relationship frames when they were interacting about, for example, the other person's identity, saying that it was a climate denier, or their relationship, so we should, or process frames when they were really communicating about how their interaction was evolving. So for example, I don't think you understand me, or but did you really look at what I said, or things like that. But the second thing that we also looked at was the framing interaction strategy. So if you have a framing difference, how did these different users throughout the interaction, how did they deal with this framing difference? Did they align with the other frame of the other person, or did they, for example, polarize even further? Based on the literature, there are 5 forms of strategies that people could take on. For example, frame incorporation, where people take or accept the other person's framing by incorporating it into their own framing and upgrading their own framing by making use of this other person's framing. Or it could also be the other way around, if people were accommodating their own framing to the other person's framing. Or it could be frame disconnection, that they just blatantly just ignored this whole alternative framing of the other person. Or frame polarization, that people even upgraded their own framing to an more extreme point, so that the frame difference even further polarized, that they were even further apart. Or frame reconnection, where they, well, this was a very this was not found a lot, but that people use the other person's framing to make their own point, but in a strange way. So what we applied this whole theoretical framework, and we tried to analyze all these climate change blog comments and how the interactions evolved over time. And we did that by analyzing the comment sections of one climate skeptical blog. What's up with that? Very well-known climate skeptical blog. And on the other hand, a climate science blog. We analyzed 5 comment threads of each blog, so 10 comment threads, which resulted in a data set of almost 1,000 comments. And we applied deductive, inductive, and abductive coding on the basis also of this theoretical framework. And the results showed, well, maybe not surprising, that we mostly found issue framing as the framing category strategy, as most interactions always start with talking about the issue. However, what was more interesting was that we found that frame polarization was the most deployed framing interaction strategy, which means that people, when they are in a discussion in the comment section, they mostly try to further polarize the framing difference, rather than that they are trying to align the frames with the person who does not agree with them at that point. And we identified that once people employ framing polarization as their interaction strategy, that always the interaction ended with frame polarization, that the framing difference was never resolved. And it was even more interesting to see that when people deployed negative identity frames, so when people said throughout an interaction, for example, you're a climate denier, you're a climate skeptic, or you're so dumb, things like that, that never the framing difference was resolved, and it always ended in frame polarization. So what I believe is that what this research shows us is that first of all, that we should widen our scope from frames also to framing, because what we learned is that when people are communicating, it's not as static as that we just deploy a frame and people accept it or reject it. No, it always happens in an interaction, and people could also choose to deploy certain frames because of this interaction. So what we could see, for example, with this negative identity framing, it also learns that once that actors who communicate in the climate change debate should really try to avoid negative identity framing, as it always results in larger framing differences, more polarization, rather than that it really resolves the issue. So I think these are the two main messages this research. And in terms of time, I'm only going to quickly discuss the results of the third paper, which is called Eco-Chambery Effects in the Climate Change Blogosphere, which was co-authored by me, Bob Mulder, and Sander van der Linde, and was published in Environmental Communication. And what we really investigated here was the audience members of the climate change blogosphere, to see if there are eco-chambery effects, as some people believe that the internet, of course, should be celebrated, as that they are exposed to many more diverse views, and there's more opportunity for deliberation. Whereas the other scholars also mentioned that there are eco-chambery effects, that people are shielded away from views that challenge their own views, as people only select content that is already in line with their views, which confirms these views and makes them even more extreme. What we did was that we conducted a survey, and we found that people with low climate change risk perceptions indeed primarily consume blogs that are climate skeptical, and people with high climate change risk perceptions indeed primarily consume blogs with mainstream views. So this is evidence for the eco-chambery effect. So here you already see in my PhD research, I wrote 6 articles there, and already in these 3 articles you see that there are these different forms of polarization on different kinds of levels, and different kinds that already take different viewpoints. So when I ended my PhD, I really had the feeling that this was not something only that I experienced, but that many more scholars did not have a strict definition of what climate change polarization really comprised. So that's why I decided to conduct a systematic literature review in online climate change polarization. Yeah, I applied a search string to look through the UvA library articles. I also critically identified a few additional articles on Google Scholar, which all needed to meet the certain inclusion criteria. And I ended up with 37 peer-reviewed articles that all use this concept of online climate change polarization. And what I would like to do is I would like to share some first preliminary results with you. And I'm also really looking forward to hearing what you think and hearing your feedback. yeah, so the first thing that I looked at was what kind of definition do they provide in their article about what online climate change polarization is. And it was striking to me to see that very few articles provided the definition of what climate change polarization meant to them. So that was already one thing. And if they provided some sort of a definition, it was mostly along the lines like ideological climate change polarization, which is a definition I think that, I'm not sure who it was, who already said that that's a form of polarization, or attitude polarization, or opinion polarization, or echo chambers, were these kinds of definitions. Well, maybe a good question to you. What do you think was the most research platform when they investigated online climate change polarization?
Facebook.
Facebook?
TikTok.
YouTube.
Okay, we've said also the major social media channels now.
All social media.
Snapchat. What's up?
Yeah, I find it funny that you say that, because I thought that everyone would say the same, or someone said it. Twitter, by far, I think 90% of all articles focused on Twitter. So that of course also skews our understanding of what online climate change polarization comprises. Then if you investigate Twitter, then there's also certain methods that you deploy, of course. And so most researchers used network analysis, community detection analysis, and hyperlinking analysis, all sorts of analysis to see what kind of communities are there in the Twitter sphere. Yeah. But then the more interesting part was what kind of pools do they identify? Because like the early work from social psychologists on group polarization theory, I think it was Myers was one of the first that really formulated an hypothesis that is really about one pool. So he formulated something like that group members of a group move to more extreme positions after group discussions. So this is more about one group that moves to a more extreme point. However, when we're talking about climate change polarization, we often perceive climate change in the context of two poles. What we already said. On one pole, people often describe climate skeptics, climate deniers, or the ones who reject the scientific consensus. These are all roughly the same kind of pool, of course. And on the other hand, they described there was a bit more diversity: climate mainstream, climate activists, climate advocates, the ones who support the scientific consensus. So there was more variety, but that's the other pool. Another thing that I found interesting to observe was that people mostly investigated climate change polarization as a state. So you have polarization, you could either investigate it as a state, so where you have two fixed positions and you look at the opposition, but you could also investigate it as a process. So how much do these positions shift? And the large majority of articles focused on online climate change polarization as a state. However, there were very few that also investigated the processes. I think, for example, my article about these comment sections is an example of that, how people adjusted their positions over time. And what these very few articles also found, that they identified a new form of polarization, or a new form, asymmetrical polarization. So what they found is that not per se when you have these two poles that they move further apart, but it is also possible that only one pole moves further apart and that you also have polarization. So that's really interesting finding, I believe. And I already explained to you this framework of positional, interactional, and effective climate change polarization that I've developed during my PhD. So I was also interested in knowing what kind of is this framework, how is it a good framework to categorize these different forms of polarization. So I also reviewed all these articles, and what I found was that indeed all these articles could be situated as either in one of these three boxes of positions, interactions, and effects. And the majority of research focused on people's positions, positional polarization, so people's attitudes, people's opinions, etc., or their interactions, which is already shown by the methods that they use. What kind of communities were there? Were there eco-chambers in the Twitter sphere, for example, or a combination of positional and interactional climate change polarization by, for example, first investigating what people's views were and then seeing whether people were connected with the same kinds of views. But there was very few research on effective climate change polarization. And the underlying mechanisms, I also tried to see what the researchers pointed at as underlying mechanisms that explain the polarization, because social psychology research shows, for example, that social comparison theory are explanations of why polarization is happening. But now you have the internet, and there are all these other forms of polarization, and researchers also point to other mechanisms that are operating online, that were already operating in society at large, but on the internet, these mechanisms are, for example, much more prominent. I roughly could categorize all the underlying mechanisms as either sharing behavior of actors online, people's linking behavior, that they primarily link, for example, with others who have like-minded views, which could also be referred to as homophilia, people's media consumption patterns, so that they primarily consume content that is in line with their pre-existing views. Also, social bots were often pointed to as an underlying mechanism of the polarization, that these also play a role, which is, of course, also really a mechanism that is really inherent to online climate change polarization, and that's climate change polarization at large. And lastly, also discursive framing, that also reinforces polarization. So this is, so taking all this new literature into account, I reconceptualized online climate change polarization as follows. I distinguished between positional, interactional, and effective climate change polarization on one axis, and on the other one, I distinguished between states and processes. So if you look at the first two left boxes, for example, about positional climate change polarization, so you first have positional climate change polarization as a state. So this assumes extreme climate change opposition as a fixed state, or this more like a process, like an increasing opposing climate change positions. If we go to the second row about interactional climate change polarization, here I defined it as a state as an absence of interaction between actors with opposing climate change viewpoints, but I also include or almost no interaction, because what I believe is that it's virtually impossible to have almost no interaction with people who have the same views. So almost no interaction, I believe that's also evidence for interactional climate change polarization as a state. And as a process, it is assumed that there are interactions, but that these interactions lead to more opposing climate change positions. So, for example, my article about these comment sections, where we found that people, when they are interacting, and that they end up with even more polarization than they started with, this is a form of interactional climate change polarization as a process. And last but not least, I looked at effective climate change polarization. Well, as a state, it refers to extreme effective emotional evaluations that reflect hostility towards opposing climate change groupings. And as a process, these increasing effective emotional evaluations. So this is the framework. However, there's also much more research needed, I believe, in online climate change polarization, as I identified a few gaps in literature. So what would be really interesting, I believe, is that we could also investigate the interactions between these different forms of online climate change polarization. So, for example, how does positional climate change polarization lead to effective climate change polarization? Or is it the other way around? Is interactional climate change polarization, for example, merely something that facilitates positional and effective climate change polarization, or does it have another role? So what are these interactions between all these different boxes? Other than that, I also believe that we need more research into other platforms than only Twitter, as of course, each platform has its own communication culture, and platforms such as YouTube, TikTok, Instagram should be also investigated and included.
Christel, is this the last slide?
Yeah.
So we need some time for questions as well.
Yeah, it's the next slide. Last slide. The next point was that I believe that also we should not underappreciate qualitative research methods such as interviews, qualitative content analysis, and traditional quantitative research methods such as experiments, since the majority of research is now focused on machine learning. Well, I do acknowledge, of course, that this also has its benefits. But I also believe that what will be interesting is that we should really reflect on the pulse and issues that we now define climate change polarization in terms of the climate skeptics versus the climate mainstream. However, of course, this whole debate of climate change is moving, and it is also could also be the case that for example, it could now be much more on where climate change is happening, on, for example, what are the solutions to climate change. So the pulse could be shifting as well. So this is something that we should reflect on and might also change the way we do research. Second, almost lastly, the process of polarization deserves more attention next to the states of polarization, and especially asymmetrical polarization. How we measure effective polarization, because often we now look at the hostility in content and this incivility. However, what I believe is that if you truly want to measure effective polarization, you really should use other methods that really truly measure people's emotions. And last but not least, there's very few research conducted that also investigates how depolarization happens, which is of course also really important. Well, I would like to thank you all for taking the time today to listen to my research, and I'm excited to talk with you and exchange some ideas about my research. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christel, for this remarkable presentation. You have used no figures in tables, and for sure that's the first time that happens in the Hot Politics Lab. There are no stars, no p-values. Fantastic. Also some nice bodily metaphors. Of course, we appreciate those. For those of you new here today, you can ask your questions in the Q&A box. You can type them there, I will read them out. And if you're here in the room, and there are 5 people here, you can just gently nudge me and I will give you an opportunity to ask your question live. Let me abuse my privilege to ask you the first question and ask you to say a little bit more about how you've spoken very little about methods. So what would be your typical way of processing the textual material that you studied?
Well, yeah, I employ different methods, but so for this comments paper, I employed a coding analysis. Also for the discourse analysis, I employed coding analysis, but my first articles, for example, I conducted interviews with climate change bloggers. And I also conducted surveys. So it is a very different and diverse methods, but I also believe that truly is important if you want to investigate something, because these different angles all give a piece of the puzzle. So to answer your main research question, yeah, I do not really define myself on the basis of one methodology.
Okay, great. Thanks. Hey, there's a question from Luca Verstegen. Thanks, Christel. Interesting research. Could you say a bit more about the methodology in your Copenhagen to Paris paper, please? You used qualitative coding and descriptive statistics. How did combining these two methodologies complement each other? What were the challenges, and overall, what was your experience from this mixed methods research?
So this was focused on one article, or
yeah, the Copenhagen to Paris for a paper.
Oh yeah. Well, actually, this was only qualitative research. So yeah, or I did some descriptive statistics where I investigated the mean and the number, but that was not really high-end statistics. So I did not use mixed methods in one article so far yet. So
okay, so
yeah.
But you would still say that overall, to answer your overall research question, you can recommend using mixed methods.
Yeah. Although you have to learn a lot of methods.
Yeah. But that's even true if you stay within the one of the two blocks.
Yeah.
Okay. There are a lot of questions. Hannah Sakno, CES. Thanks for a great presentation, Christel. What about climate change polarization within the political debate? How politicians communicate about it? Green parties versus mainstream parties or populist parties?
What about? Yeah, I think there are very similar polarization dynamics going on there. Of course, in the online world, there are certain dynamics going on, for example, with filter bubbles or the incivility online because people can be anonymous, that are really characteristic for the online debate. For the political debate, however, I think there are very similar. For example, the positional and effective climate change polarization is really there as well, and that there's also a lot of incivility. For example, there's what I will first take, for example, this result of my comments paper, where I found that if we deploy negative identity labels, that the discussion only further polarizes. Well, now I know I'm aware of this finding, and I see it everywhere. But also scientists doing it, but also politicians, that they label the other party with a negative identity label, which is not beneficial if you really want to involve this other person and convince them of your viewpoint. So I thought that is interesting.
Thanks. Then we have questions from Matthijs Roda, and there are more essays actually. So there are two different essays. I'll start with the first one. Okay. He says, "Oh, thank you, Christel, blah, blah, blah. To what extent is category-free climate skeptical science necessarily different from one, hoax, and two, no scientific evidence? Can't they all be part of the same story?"
Yeah, so this hoax storyline was really rooted in a political ontology, where it was really about this conspiracy narrative that people are colluding. Well, the no scientific evidence really focused, in a scientific ontology, really focused on the science. So the first was more focused on the politics, the second more on the science. So also the heroes or the villains were, for example, climate scientists primarily in the second storyline, and the first storyline politicians. Well, and there were more things like that.
And could they technically be part of the same blog post?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Hey, and then Matthijs' second question is regarding category 4. So that's so he's right, regarding category 4, is this necessarily climate skeptical? Couldn't people argue that there is injustice and be against big investments in green policies, not because they are skeptical, but because they prioritize other things, for instance, the yellow vest movement? In other words, they argue that there is injustice, but at the same time acknowledge that climate change takes place and is a problem. Yeah,
well, I agree that this storyline could also be part of a discourse of other groups, but we also identified it in the climate skeptical discourse. But I don't believe that this storyline is exclusive to the climate skeptical discourse. Just like with the climate activist discourse, we also identified storylines that could apply, for example, also to climate scientists.
Okay, great. Thanks. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I can also wait for. Okay, I'm here in the back.
Yeah, hi.
Thanks for this super engaging talk. And I have a slightly more fundamental question about your conceptualization, reconceptualization. Which I love your matrix, and I think it's very useful, especially to distinguish between state and process. It just made me wonder what it is that makes climate change online polarization different from online polarization in general. I thought that all of these definitions you had in this matrix could be very well applied to online polarization about any other topic. Let's maybe take immigration as an example. So I'm kind of wondering on a theoretical level, what makes climate change different here from other issues?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. So I only looked at the climate change polarization literature, as climate change polarization is often also applied as a concept on its own. So for example, looking at the poles, but I did not want to specify the poles in this framework on purpose, because I believe that these poles also could shift over time. What are the stances that people take on? So I agree, if you just leave out climate change opposition, I believe that this framework can also be applied to other realms other than climate change.
Cool. And maybe then one more remark. It's just a tiny thing, but there was also this term of climate change opposition in there. Mm-hmm. We describe the state of people being polarized, right, in the state dimension.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you've already kind of set this term in stone, but at first sight, I felt it was a bit confusing, because it sounds like it describes people being opposed to climate change. I mean, everyone is opposed to climate change, right? Unless you're really, really cold.
Yeah.
But I think opposition is maybe not the perfect word for what you're trying to capture here. It's not that I have a better word, but
yeah, I know.
At first, for me, it read like that's people opposed to climate change or people opposed to climate change policies, but you're describing a distance between positions.
Yeah.
Here, right? So,
yeah. Thanks for the feedback. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I will think about it a bit more.
There was actually once upon a time a pro-climate change political party in Russia.
Yeah. It's cold in Russia.
I can imagine that.
and permafrost.
Yeah. Hey, there's a question from Nafudita Pandey, one of our students. In developing countries like India, climate change polarization exists across generations. The younger generation is more vocal, while the older generation feels it might be a hoax. Yeah, that's, I think, true here in the Netherlands too. What is your take on it?
What we see is indeed that climate change polarization is present, well, I guess all over the world, but is especially present in Western countries and especially the US and the UK. But I also believe that we really see a shift, that whereas there was first polarization around whether climate change was happening, it's now much more about how severe will the impact be, or should we act upon it. And so the discussion has shifted over years, so that's interesting. And there are less skeptics. That's also what you see in the numbers.
There's a question.
Yeah. Yes, thanks, Christel. Very interesting. My question is this: why blogs? So why do we no? But because is this a particular? On the one hand, you said, well, this is a particular type of people, but there's also been some recent work by Michael Bank-Peterson that suggests that people who are assholes online are not nice people in real life as well. So is this a case of studying behavior of people that they would also show at work or at the schoolyard, or is this a particular type of polarization that we want to understand because it happens in the online world and is distinct from the behavior outside of this online world? And that has implications for what it means for polarization at large, right? Yeah, well, I think there's two ways how you can answer that question. In the beginning, I forgot to explain to you why I investigated the blogosphere, because the blogosphere, it's really interesting because here you can really see this polarization, as blogs are the main communication channel or platform basically of climate skeptics. Climate scientists, for example, have scientific publication through which they interact. Climate skeptics use this platform of blogs. So that's really, other than the other platforms as Twitter, blogs is their main communication outlet.
where they also ponder on their ideas. Having said that, I do believe that these people, or climate skeptics, are also in the normal world. They display or exhibit perhaps certain things that also contribute to this climate change polarization. However, I believe online that it's also more easily extreme, since people are, for example, anonymous or behind their computers. So it's more easy for them to be more extreme.
Very quick follow-up. Do you have any estimate of the what percentage of the population is active on these blogs, or what's their readership, especially on both sides, right? So
yeah. So we conducted one survey, and it's very difficult to get a good grasp of what the readership is. But what we learned from the survey is that it are especially men, older men from Western countries. So the US, UK. Also interesting, most of these people have a PhD or a master's degree. So that's also what we know from climate change polarization, is that people assume often that people are stupid who are climate skeptical. However, what we often see is that people who are most polarized around climate change also have the highest technical reasoning capacity. So that's also what our research supported that view.
Thanks.
That's interesting. Sorry. Next, I had to think about all this research about reasoning capacity and showing that they're more vulnerable for people who score low on this are more vulnerable for misinformation, but you're actually arguing the opposite. Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, there's a question from Konrad Kiljan, and I will say Konrad will answer your email later today. Konrad asks, have you considered looking at other dimensions of polarization in the selected free? Would partisanship and ideological preferences be connected mainly with the positional one, or be considered from a different angle?
I'm not sure whether I understand the question. So
you had different dimensions of polarization, the effective,
yeah,
the interactional, and the, I forgot the name.
Effective and a positional, yeah.
Positional, yeah. And then, so the question is whether partisanship should be, are they both part of the positional one, or is this another dimension you should distinguish?
Yeah, so positional is more related to like this cognition, but I agree maybe that you could also, because I perceive now positional climate change polarization as either, for example, people's attitudes, opinions, ideologies, really like their stances around climate change, whereas effective climate change polarization is really this emotional feeling. But maybe you have beyond cognition and people's emotional feelings, even another dimension. That's something that I could look into even more, yeah. So thanks for that comment.
Thanks. I have a last question for you. You've talked a lot about polarization and poles, and it's interesting. I mean, we come from the country of pillarization, right? So it was sort of a multipolar society.
Mm-hmm.
And this language of polarization typically implies there are just two sides of it, which I think is a terminology very much infused by the American experience, which at least politically is very much bipolar. Looking at the discussions on climate change, would you say we really need two dimensions, or is there perhaps sort of a third group of people that talk about climate change in a way that makes them very distinct?
Well, I'm not per se arguing that we need two dimensions. I'm more arguing that I wanted to conceptualize how previous research has understood climate change polarization. So I agree that also around climate change, that this debate is not per se polarized. So I have not investigated the results of all these studies. I've really looked at their theoretical conceptualization of climate change polarization. So, what was the second part of your question?
So the second part is whether do we need two dimensions or three dimensions or four dimensions? I mean, you've suggested different storylines.
Mm-hmm.
How do these group together? if we're going to place people into boxes, I mean, that's what we do as social scientists. Then how many boxes do we need in order to categorize them based on the climate change stories?
Yeah, I think that's different in each context. So what I found interesting for example, when I investigated the audiences, that we could really see that either their climate change risk perceptions were really low or really high. There was not a lot of middle ground. So for the climate change blogosphere, I believe that it is severely polarized between these two camps. Whereas I believe, for example, in the Dutch political system, we have many more poles and colors. So it depends on the context.
A very quick minor question, if
there's time, so on that point, I'm wondering whether the fact that you find it's very polarized isn't also heavily influenced by your choice of blogs, right? Because I mean, who are the people who go to blogs? They're like really into the topic, and I think it's much more likely for them to be very strong on either side than the general population. I mean, my intuition would be that in the general population, at least in Europe, we wouldn't find such a strong polarization, at least on the question of whether climate change is a thing or not. Maybe on the policy side, but
I agree with you. Yeah, I think so too. My research on blog consumption showed that people, on average, visit these either climate skeptical blogs or climate mainstream blogs 18 days a week, and then for more than an hour. So that's really a highly engaged public. However, this is a breeding ground, of course, for climate skepticism, and we don't know to what extent they, for example, communicate with their friends and family. But what we do know is that the climate change blogosphere has impacted political discourse, scientific discourse, public discourse, media discourse on several instances. So, for example, I'm not sure whether you are familiar with the ClimateGate debate, when all these emails were leaked from climate scientists, and climate skeptics took this as evidence that climate change was a hoax. Well, this was a big scandal. And here the climate change blogs were, for example, leading the discussion, and the traditional media were feeding on the work of these climate change blogs. So they were really opinion leaders, so to say. So the climate change blogosphere does have, although it's perhaps a small community of people, it does have an effect on discourses around that.
Okay, we're gonna wrap up. Christel, thank you. I have a feeling you have more to say about this than that we could fit in 1 hour. So the good thing is that, as far as I understand, you will be around here for the future, so that we can hopefully see some more of your work coming out of your time here at Ascor and being presented here in our lab. I want to take the last minute, first of all, to thank first of all, the participants, right? This is only as fun as that we have good questions, and I also want to thank some of our sponsors, which is obviously the University of Amsterdam and the two respective institutes that we work, the Amsterdam School of Communication Research and the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, as well as the ERC that is funded to Gijs, some money from the Dutch Science Foundation that we have gotten, and we should not forget the Society for Politics and the Life Sciences, who is co-sponsoring us. Did I forget any funders, Gijs?
So it's the Association for Politics.
Oh, the Association for Politics and the Life Sciences. No. We are,
and Shell.
We are open for commercial sponsors as well. And in particular, Patrick Stewart of the Association for Politics and Life Sciences. Let me conclude by just saying that next week we have Amélie Godefroy, who is from the Norwegian University. I always forget that name.
Norway.
No, Norway. She's from Belgium now, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and she will give a talk on how terrorism is changing us. And Amélie is doing pretty spectacular work in this topic and follows open science principles. And then the week after, February 18th, we have Maaike Homan on some, I just saw the results of her experiments that look pretty exciting. The consequences of emotional politicians, a conjoined experiment, and a former master student and now PhD candidate at the University of Bern Chiara Fiali. In the weeks ahead, we have Matthijs Roodduin who will come and present. He will give shorter, we'll give him long questions and he will give short answers. And among other people, Josh Kalla from Yale, Ruben Slothoff from Aarhus University, and my former colleague and good friend Jif Lelkes from the University of Pennsylvania. So a lot to look ahead to in the coming weeks, but for now it's almost weekend. So thank you very much, Christel. Once more, thank you. Look forward to seeing you again in person in Amsterdam. All
yeah,
right.
thank you all.
Do it.
Bye.